Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Well, thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility on this Tuesday. It is the 12th day of July in the year 2016. The 12th day of July happens to, it's a day that kind of is important to me because this would have been my dad's birthday. And he would have been 104 years old today. He was born in he'd have been 107 because he was born in 1909, July 12th, 1909. And I also have a stepson whose birthday is today as well. And I usually remember one by remembering the other, if that makes sense. And so this is one day I always react to. And as I mentioned some months ago, here we were talking about my email address, the W.A. O'Brien 906. The 906 comes from the fact that my dad was always a pretty good gambler, and he used to be involved in booking numbers in the Boston area when I was a kid, when I was growing up, and 906 was his favorite number, and so I put it on my email address because it's an easy number for me to remember. It's one I'll never forget, obviously, because it was my dad's favorite. But anyway, and so also was 7/12, his birthday. All I can think of when I think of him is he used to say all the time, 7/12 with a 5, 7/12 with a 5. So anyway, if tonight the three numbers in the West Virginia lottery happen to be 7/12, I will die. I promise you, right on the spot here. Welcome to this afternoon's program here at the Virtual Center. We're kind of back into the heat and humidity of summer. It's rained a little bit earlier before lunch today. And then the sun came out, and so it's absolutely steamy out there. It's a sauna, and but it's absolutely gorgeous. I'm inside now looking out, and it is absolutely pretty right now. I guess we'll probably get some additional showers later on. Welcome to the program, and it'll be a continuation of the program that we began yesterday, which linked the moral sense of Thomas Jefferson with some of the racial issues and the discussion that is going on based on the resurfacing, if you will, it periodically surfaces, of course, of racial issues in this country as reflected of late by the shooting a week ago, more than a week ago now, of an unarmed black man in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, followed by the shooting of another in St. Paul, Minnesota. And then finally on Friday night, of course, we had the retaliatory massacre of 5 policemen and the wounding of others as well. And the conversation has continued to go on since then. President Obama cut his trip to the NATO meeting in Europe by a day so that he could get back for the memorial services today in Dallas. And I've been pretty much on the go all morning and haven't had a chance to follow up on this, but my assumption is everything is still go. I just happened to note a comment on the internet just before we went on the air, which suggested that which said that Bernie Sanders had appeared in Portsmouth, New Hampshire today with Hillary Clinton and endorsed Hillary for president of the United States, which was pretty much anticipated as one of the lead political items of the day. So here we are in early in the afternoon on a Tuesday on the 12th day of July, and it is a pleasure to be with you. I do encourage you to participate even more actively in the program than you do by listening to it, especially if you are live. By all means, feel free to pick up the phone and go on the air and share your thoughts and your ideas. This issue of racial intolerance, if you will, that exists in our society, we'll kind of go back to that a little bit, at least at the beginning of our program today. And then eventually we'll kind of move our way back into some of the issues related more specifically to Thomas Jefferson. But I do encourage you to share your thoughts and your ideas and your opinions or your suggestions or whatever they might be with our other listeners on the phone number that we have just for that purpose. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. And of course, 4676, as we know, translates on your keypad into HORN, H-O-R-N. So that's 304-663-HORN. If you'd like to get on the air, you'll go directly into the studios of the Hit On Radio Network. Bob probably undoubtedly chat with you for a moment, and then we'll get you immediately on the air. If you would like to share your thoughts or your ideas or suggestions with me one-on-one in an email, I do invite you to do that. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. And of course, I mentioned the origin of the 906 earlier, just a few moments ago. And then finally, I do encourage you to kind of keep an eye on our Facebook page. If you are a regular user of Facebook, you just go to Facebook, to the homepage, and in the search box at the top of the homepage, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will be into our Facebook page. And there are a number of postings there that have been posted over the last several weeks, the most recent being last. And I have taken to put quite a bit on Facebook of late. And I do encourage you to take a look at it and feel recognize that by the mere fact that those postings are there, they are there because they solicit and invite comment. And so however you would choose to comment, whether it would be to call us on the air while we're live, or whether it would be to drop me an email, or whether it would be to make yourself, to take advantage of the opportunities on Facebook itself, to comment on some of the postings that are there, I encourage you to do that. And I would look forward to the opportunity to share your ideas and your thinking with our listeners as best we could, as best I can. And again, I will as much as possible make sure that I don't change anything. I will try to present your thoughts, your ideas, as indeed you presented them, and make your thinking available to some of our other listeners. But again, if you would like to do that yourself, then I do encourage you to pick up the phone and call our phone number at 304-663-4676. I spent quite a little bit of time after our program yesterday thinking about the program, because I began to appreciate, to realize how very, very important it is. And I'll be very honest, in my reading last evening and in my reading earlier today, I think that what we touched on, of course, is a major issue. I was looking at a number of publications earlier today, first thing this morning, and I found any number of articles or commentaries on the racial issues that have surfaced over the last week or so in this country. And of course, this is what has prompted President Obama to make his way back to the country a day early in order to participate in the memorial service in Dallas today for the 5 policemen. This morning in our local statewide newspaper here in West Virginia, the Charleston Gazette, and I do invite you to take a look at these things. It's wvgazette.com, and you can see these on. Just look up. Just click on opinion, and you will see these letters in these articles. There was an article in the Gazette today, written by Danielle Allen. Danielle Allen is a faculty member, a professor, philosophy professor at Harvard, and she penned an article which was reprinted in our local paper here in West Virginia just this morning on the issue of racial violence in the United States. And she lays it all on the issue of the war on drugs. Her position is that the war on drugs, which I think many people would honestly say probably has not succeeded, it's cost a lot of money, but I don't think that we have done as much as we would need to do in order to claim any kind of a victory in the war on drugs. And over the years, we haven't been able to do much better. Her point is that the war on drugs has pretty much put us at war one against the other. And that war is tinged with racism. And consequently, it seems to me that her feeling is that if we could find a way to end the war on drugs, end the war of one against the other, then we could begin the healing process that would be necessary to bring the races together. It's really difficult to challenge that thinking, because I don't think that there are too many people out there who would disagree with what she's saying. There's no question that there are clear racial overtones to the war on drugs. Of course, the fact of the matter is, if we go back to things we were talking about here at the Virtual Center yesterday, it is my feeling, and again, this is just my feeling, I have to recognize the qualifications and the reputation of Danielle Allen. I'm not necessarily taking issue with her at all, but I believe that the issues go deeper. I think that the war on drugs is more a symbol of racial tensions in this country, which go deeper. Interesting enough, in the same publication, in today's West Virginia, today's is a letter to the editor, and basically in the issue of hate, that when you get down to the bottom line, there's just too much hate in this country. And again, I don't think that anyone would take serious issue with that either. But again, I think it's even possible to go even deeper than that. It seems to me, and this is in the category, I guess, of somewhat of a review of some of the things that we discussed yesterday, so that hopefully we can move on, use today's program to move on a bit. But it seems to me that the issue of hate is more the outcome than the cause of the issue. It seems to me, especially given what we've talked about with Jefferson and the idea of the moral sense, if you agree with Jefferson, if you agree with these Scottish philosophers in the Enlightenment, if you do agree that there is this conscience, this inbred sense or ability or inclination within mankind to do good, to do for his fellow man, if you do believe it's there, I personally do. And it has been my belief for some time that when you clear away all the clutter, all the fluff, all the superficial stuff, this may be the basis of major differences between conservatives and liberals in our society. It seemed to me more than anything else, what defines a liberal in today's society is the assumption of a reason for optimism, that there is basically good in mankind, in all mankind. I think probably more than anything else, the foundation of conservatism is based on the idea that human nature is indeed basically evil. And again, whether in fact you trace it back into the origins of Christianity and the idea of original sin and the stain of original sin that has been passed on through the generations ever since Adam's sin, so-called, then it seems to me that that is pretty much the religious philosophical origin, if you will, of this view of human nature, which is the one that Jefferson criticizes. The idea of the moral sense causes one to criticize this negative view of human nature and suggest that there is a more positive possibility. But that in effect, if the entire world we live in, the society we live in, and the society we are reared into is based on the assumptions of particular assumptions about human nature, then it stands to reason that even if there is such a thing as a moral sense, it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, for it to surface. The only way to allow it to surface is to believe in it and cultivate it, encourage it, strengthen it, which is Jefferson's argument. And his point is that it's there to be encouraged, and indeed he takes on the issue in numerous places of suggesting ways to do it. In the particular letter that we looked at the other day, Jefferson suggested that reading the great books, good books, is a way to sustain the so-called moral sense, to encourage it, to strengthen it, to give it credibility, to reinforce it, to do all of those things. The fact of the matter is, it's there, it's susceptible to being strengthened according to Jefferson, and I believe according to the philosophy which undergirds liberalism generally. I think that's the issue. We talked yesterday about Rousseau, and Rousseau's belief, of course, is that the moral sense actually dominates mankind if we would just let it, that it's man's institutions which repress man's natural inclinations to allow the moral sense to flourish. Rousseau believes that if we could find a way to turn man free, to free man from the restrictions and the negative controls of the society and the culture that he lives in, then man's moral sense would come forth. And many of the problems that we see in the world around us would disappear once the moral sense within all of us was allowed to flourish and actually begin to dominate human behavior. And so basically, it seems to me that that is really the issue on which much of this turns. Basically, then, it seems to me, going back to the original issue we were talking about, which is the two articles, one on the war on drugs and the other one on the need to eliminate hate in our society, I think that both of these are remnants or symbols of the kind of society we live in. And without getting into and spending a whole lot of time on the nature of the society we live in, I would just point to programs and issues that we dealt with in the past, dealing with things like the nature of the new capitalism, Richard Sennett's idea, the emphasis on skills and talents, and the tendency to dismiss people because their potential is limited. In other words, to emphasize the negatives rather than the positives within people. The fact of the matter is the nature of society in general and its institutions is to emphasize and encourage, focus upon the differences between us rather than the things that unite us. And of course, the major thing that we're talking about is the idea of the moral sense. And so basically what that means is we live in a world which focuses principally on the differences between us rather than the similarities between us. And it seems to me too simple to be possible as a solution. The fact that once you accept the idea of the moral sense, you just flip the entire situation upside down. That you suddenly make a decision that starting next Monday morning, the entire world is going to start emphasizing the similarities amongst people rather than the differences. These are not things that you cognitively decide to do. It's much more than that. It's not choosing a strategy or a game plan. It basically involves the idea that you must absolutely embrace the realities of this fact that, in a sense, your whole being would need to change. What we're talking about here is a massive cultural change. It wouldn't happen overnight. It couldn't happen overnight. But it seems to me it can't happen at all until we're willing to take the issue seriously and begin to accurately and honestly reflect upon it. That, in other words, that we honestly consider this as a possibility, not merely as an unrealistic, impractical set of ideals that are totally contradictory to the way human nature really is. We believe, our institutions tell us, and we've seen this in the structure of our Constitution, in the way that the Constitution was structured according to Madison and Hamilton in the Federalist Papers. We have seen that the entire world around us is organized, is founded, is structured on a particular definition of human nature. And as human beings who are socialized or indoctrinated, if you will, into the particular society we live in, then all of us are reared to believe that this view of human nature is indeed the only one possible. In other words, we tend to assume that we know what human nature is. And all you have to do, it seems to me, is think for a few moments, how many times have you heard people make the claim when they're trying to explain something, well, it's just human nature. And the response you get is a nod of the head, because how do you argue against that? If somebody says it's human nature to do such and such, then the only way that you can challenge that is to challenge this definition of human nature. And how do you do that when the whole world around us is organized on a particular view of human nature which you take issue with? How do you go about beginning to turn that around? What we're talking about here is a monumental task. But it seems to me it has to begin somewhere. And I think where we are right now, which is here on a Tuesday afternoon on the 12th day of July in the year 2016, is as good a place to begin as anywhere. Yesterday, we looked at a passage from Emerson's essay on the Oversoul. I never used this. I've used this particular passage in class, in history classes, for a number of years. And I have to honestly say that I never use it, put it away, and forget about it until the next time. It's not the kind of thing that I find it easy to forget. When I read it, when I look at it as we did yesterday, when we discuss it as we did yesterday, it stays with me. It's not something that you can just discard, that you can turn off when the particular program or the particular class is over. Because one of the things that I always think about after the fact on this thing is, what if, and this is a game, call it a game. I used to suggest to students, I used to call it what if history. Let's pretend that this is true. Let's pretend, for purposes of discussion, that we all agree 100% with what Emerson says. With that, and this is again review of yesterday, let me return to that passage and refresh your memory if you were with us yesterday. If you weren't, then maybe this is your first exposure to this. So let me share with you the passage that I'm talking about. It's in the early sections on the first page of Emerson's essay on the Oversoul. You can find the essay on the internet. Just Google or just type in on your search engine, Type in Emerson's Oversoul in quotations, and you'll find all sorts of references. Just click on one, and you can find the original. Emerson says the following: "The supreme critic on the errors of the past and the present, and the only prophet of that which must be, is that great nature in which we rest, as the earth lies in the soft arms of the atmosphere. That unity, that oversoul, within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other." The idea of an overriding unity, an overriding issue, which Emerson calls the oversoul, that connects all of us, that connects all human beings as being somehow interconnected, somehow related, somehow part of what Emerson calls a unity, in which every man's being is contained and made one with all other. That common heart of which all sincere conversation is the worship, to which all right action is submission. In other words, when everybody's on the same page and everybody is clear on what reality is, what truth really is, then by definition, submitting to it is when all of us begin to do right, because doing right is what we now have in common. Once we recognize and appreciate the unity, the oversoul, if you will, that connects us, once we accept that as being true, once we submit to it, then by definition, our actions on the basis of that truth are the right actions. We naturally begin to do right. Emerson goes on, that overpowering reality which confutes our tricks and talents and constrains everyone to pass for what he is and to speak from his character, not from his tongue, and which evermore tends to pass into our thought and hand and become wisdom and virtue and power and beauty. What Emerson is saying here is that once this reality becomes dominant, once we all accept it and submit to it, then what we begin to experience coming from everyone is wisdom and virtue and power and beauty, the beauty of truth, the beauty of reality, if you will. We live in succession, Emerson says, in division, in parts, in particles. Meantime, within man is the soul of the whole. In other words, we've been divided up into all of these parts. We're parents, we're males or we're females, we're parents, we're husbands and wives and parents, we're relatives, we're professionals, we work for a living, we're volunteers, we're members of this group and that group and another group. In other words, our lives are chopped up into pieces, into so many pieces that it becomes difficult most of the time for us to even realize that there's some sort of basic unity which connects it all. In other words, we're so focused on the parts, on the divisions within which we conduct our lives, that we lose sight of the overriding unity that connects all of us. And if all of society is organized that way, then it's no wonder most of us never even get to appreciate the possibility of the kind of unity that connects all of us. We live, he says, in succession, in division, in parts, in particles. Meantime, within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. And this deep power in which we exist, and whose beatitude is all accessible to us, is not only self-sufficing and perfect in every hour, but the act of seeing and the thing seen, the seer and the spectacle, the subject and the object are one. In other words, we're all part of a world that is interconnected, where everything is related somehow to somebody else, to something else. It's the ultimate product of a design plan, of a grand design, if you want to call it that. Emerson believes that. He doesn't reject the idea of a divine being or of a creator. In fact, he accepts it. And basically his argument is that the world around us, the beauty of the world, nature, the world that God created for us, the beauty of it, once we begin to appreciate and see the unity which connects it and makes it all interrelated, then we begin to come back into contact with the so-called soul of the whole, the eternal one. We see the world piece by piece, Emerson says, as the sun, the moon, the animal, the tree. But the whole, of which these are the shining parts, is the soul. Only by the vision of that wisdom can the horoscope of the ages be read, and by falling back on our better thoughts, by yielding to the spirit of prophecy, which is innate in every man, we can know what it saith. In other words, this reality is within all of us. The challenge is for us to see it and appreciate it, begin to recognize it for exactly what it is, and to begin to turn our lives around in order to give it the credibility that it deserves. Again, back to the question or to the challenge that we posed just before we looked at this particular quotation from Emerson. Pretend for a moment that this was true. Assume for purposes of discussion. In other words, humor us. Pretend that you agree with it. If you believe what Emerson says here, what is going to be different in the day-to-day world in which you live? What will be different? What won't make sense anymore? In other words, what is there in the world as you see it right now which seems to make perfect sense? What is it that won't make sense anymore once you believe Emerson? One of the things that would become totally unrealistic, impossible to accept, is hate, is war, is violence. Because if you really accept the fact that we are all connected, that we are all part of some eternal one, as it were, then it would be totally out of the context of reality. It would be inconsistent. It would be a contradiction. It would be an absurdity to hate one who is connected to you in that way. Suddenly then, things like race language, religion, national origin, gender preference, if you will. All of the things that we tend to emphasize today, which divide us one from another, would disappear. Because our focus would be on those things which we have in common, those things which unite us. I ask you to consider the fact that if you think back to the Federalist Papers and to some of the things that we've looked at with Madison, isn't Madison's whole idea of the operations and the realistic nature of Republican government based on this kind of general acceptance, on this kind of agreement? Madison believes that if a group of intelligent, committed people come together and are able to leave their own self-interest at the door, as it were. In other words, not to bring their own self-interest, their own agendas into the room. Rather, everybody enters the room with one ultimate object in mind, and that's to make decisions with your colleagues in the interests of everyone, in the public interest, for the common good. If realizing the common good for all of those you represent is not only the priority, but the only priority, the only objective which brings you together, then think of the cooperation that would fill that room. When Madison talks about the need in order for Republican government to work, when Madison talks about the need for deliberation, negotiation, compromise, that's what leadership is to use a process, a competitive process, which is a series of elections, in order to cause those people with the most focus on doing good for their fellow man to surface. And if your population is educated sufficiently to be able to recognize those qualities in the candidates you are asked to vote for, then what we would end up with is a group of representatives representing the constituents who elected them. Your job would be to come together with the representatives of other constituents throughout the nation, and together use your wisdom and your talents and your abilities to negotiate and deliberate and compromise, with the ultimate goal being the common good or the public interest. Madison believes that that is the hope, that is the promise of Republican government. It doesn't mean that he's impractical. It doesn't mean that he's pie in the sky. But it means that that's the ideal. That's the golden ring. That's what we all strive to achieve. And our lives are spent in pursuit of that ultimate goal. That's what representative government in a republic would be about. That's what progress, as we move step by step towards that ultimate goal, that would be progress for all mankind. And by definition, the quality of life and standard of living of the population, of the citizens that we represent, would continue to improve. And the system would work so well for so many that others throughout the world could not resist the need to model their systems after this one. We would literally, as John Winthrop said in his sermon in 1630 on the Arbella, we would indeed become the city on the hill, the basis for the reform of the entire world, so that the good of mankind would be transformed into a model of what we created. Winthrop argued that that was God's plan. That's why God chose them to come to the New World, in order that they could begin again and they could create the kind of society, the kind of life that true community was about. I would suggest to you that that's the ultimate answer to the racial tensions. I don't mean that we can accomplish it probably in our lifetimes, most likely in our lifetimes. We surely can't decide that we're going to accomplish it the first Monday in the third week in July of the year 2016. We can't do that. It's not the kind of decision that you make cognitively. It's an entire change that begins at the very root, at the very soul, if you will, of our culture, of our society. Once you accept this as truth, once you accept this as reality, as being the golden ring, as it were, then many of the things that currently divide us, that separate us, that cause problems within us, amongst us, would disappear. Many of the things that we take for granted and associate with the definition of human nature that we've bought into would suddenly look absurd. They wouldn't make any sense anymore. That's the power of what this, in the extreme, that's the power of what this change in worldview would mean for mankind. It's a process that has to begin. This is very personal. But over the years, I have pretty well accepted this as the reason we are here. I think the reason that we were created is to bring this about, is to find a way to make this happen. And I think many of the things that do happen, the violence and the racism and the hatred and the bigotry and the separations and the exclusion and the idea, the goals of certain people to not have to live with other people. The idea that success in our society is being able to afford to live in a gated community with a guard on it to keep out those you don't want to relate to or have anything to do with. I would suggest to you that's a definition of reality that I personally have decided that I am not comfortable with. I never was comfortable with it. It seems to me that the ultimate goal, the ultimate truth that all of us were put here to pursue is this. And the irony is, if you look at the philosophies, the Eastern philosophers, if you look at some of the ancient philosophers and look at some of the ideas and the theories that they wrestled with, This is really what all of them are after, are the ultimate truth. And all of us need to be pursuing it, and all of us need to be taking steps, however small they are, in that direction, toward that ultimate goal. And it seems to me one of the greatest threats to it are those people who claim that they have already seen truth. They know what it is. Just follow me. Just do what I say. Believe what I tell you to believe. And you will know truth. You will know God's truth. God spoke to me and told me what his divine plan is, what truth is. The minute you believe me, you stop looking for it yourself. And I would suggest when that happens, you are no longer on the road less traveled. You are on the road most frequently traveled by mankind through the ages. And as you look back in history, you can begin to see what that road has wrought for mankind. All of it is rooted in a basic respect for the human being as a human being. An appreciation of humanity for what it is. An appreciation for the idea of what being human means. Different societies have taken it upon themselves to define that for their own people. I would suggest when you begin to delve deeply within yourself in order to discover it, you begin to go in the very same direction that Emerson went. You are heading in the same direction that caused him to write this in his essay on the Oversoul. You are headed towards the same place that Plato was in. When Plato spoke in his allegory of the cave, of the reality that truth already exists within every one of us. The challenge is to make it visible. The challenge is to find a way to get man to look within himself and begin to see it and appreciate it and value it. To Plato, that's what education was about. To Thomas Jefferson, that's what education was about. I really think the abstract. I appreciate that. This is difficult stuff, I think. And much of what I'm saying are not answers. They are speculations. The more I read and the more I've thought on this over the years, the more this kind of explains what I think all of us need to begin to reflect upon. We need to begin to think on it. We need to begin to pursue it, to read about it, to confront what other people have said about it. This morning, I took the liberty of printing off a document. It's a document, portions of which we've made reference to before. But this morning, I printed off a substantial portion of this. This is Jefferson's letter to John Adams. And let me explain, if we go back into the 18th century for a moment. This exchange between John Adams and Jefferson after Jefferson left the White House, after the political world that these men lived in for most of their lives was over. John Adams had been vice president and president, and then he had been retired for more than a dozen years. Thomas Jefferson had been president, and that ended when Madison was elected to be president in the election of 1808. And so Jefferson is effectively out of politics. Not that he's not interested in politics anymore. He never loses that interest. But he ceases to be a player in day-to-day politics. Except that Jefferson immediately takes on the creation of the University of Virginia and begins to promote his ideas on education, because that's what Jefferson believes will save the Republic. He never varies from that goal. And even though for many years John Adams and Thomas Jefferson did not speak because of the political differences between them that surfaced and became such major political issues in the 1790s, during the Washington administration when John Adams was vice president, but especially after George Washington delivered his farewell address in 1796 and decided to not seek a third term. And John Adams became president of the United States for 4 years in the late 1790s, to be followed into office in 1800 by Thomas Jefferson. During those political squabbles, it took years before these men spoke. But once they began to speak, did they ever begin to speak? And in an exchange of letters, and we can find these letters, they are existent. They're available to all of us on the internet. They are rich as these men growing older are beginning to speculate with each other on what life is about, what government is about, what's man's existence about, what's truth about. They begin to wrestle with the ultimate questions. And the fact of the matter is, if you look at this exchange, which begins after Jefferson leaves the White House, it begins probably during Madison's administration in probably around 1811, 1812. And you see these letters, 1813, 1814, 1815, 1817. And what you begin to see is the letters are huge. They're extremely long and they're extremely deep. And the fact of the matter is, on many issues, John Adams is the instigator of the conversations. John Adams is the one who is having real issues, who's in real turmoil with some of this stuff. Adams believes all the way through his political career in the need of a natural aristocracy. John Adams never for 1 second accept even the remote possibility that all men are in any way equal. John Adams believes that there is a natural aristocracy, an aristocracy of talent, an aristocracy of virtue and ability and commitment, and that these people, few as they be, are the ones who need to be in positions of power. They need to be able to make decisions for everybody else, because they are the ones who have the wisdom to lead society in the proper directions. And in the late 1780s, in mid-1780s, 86, 87, when John Adams writes his 3-volume Defense of American Government, I believe it's called, a constitutional government, something like that. In it, he is defending the idea of aristocracy to the point that he's pilloried for it. Many Americans reject the idea of aristocracy totally and believe the rhetoric of the revolution, that all men are created equal. And so Adams becomes extremely unpopular. And he's criticized frequently for his arrogance, for his elitism. Consequently, when he and Jefferson begin this correspondence, it's Adams who finds himself trying to defend himself and explain himself. And he's bouncing his ideas and his thinking off Jefferson. And Jefferson is giving John Adams the wisdom of this incredible mind. And the reality, the product of these exchanges is absolutely incredible. This particular letter is from Jefferson to John Adams. It's dated the 28th of October, 1813. The War of 1812 is on. The nation is at war. And Jefferson writes this. Now, this is not the entire letter. This is just an excerpt from it. But it's a fairly extensive one. And I wanted to share it with you because it deals with this issue of aristocracy. Here's what Jefferson says. I agree with you that there is a natural aristocracy among men. The grounds of this are virtue and talents. Formerly, bodily powers gave place among the aristoi. The aristoi is the Greek for aristocrats. Formerly, in other words, in the old days, in ancient times, bodily powers, physical strength, gave place among the aristocracy. Those who were the elite, who were the aristocrats, were the most powerful. But since the invention of gunpowder has armed the weak as well as the strong with missile death, bodily strength, like beauty, good humor, politeness, and other accomplishments, has become but an auxiliary ground for distinction. In other words, with the inventions of gunpowder and other things, it has destroyed the idea that physical strength alone entitles one to position and power, to being a member of an aristocracy. Jefferson says there is also an artificial aristocracy founded on wealth and birth, without either virtue or talents. For with these, it would belong to the first class. In other words, the artificial aristocracy is based on wealth and birth, but they don't have virtue and talents, because if they did, they would be members of the natural aristocracy, not the artificial aristocracy. The natural aristocracy, Jefferson says, I consider as the most precious gift of nature for the instruction, the trusts, the government of society. And indeed, it would have been inconsistent in creation to have formed man for the social state and not to have provided virtue and wisdom enough to manage the concerns of the society. What Jefferson is saying is the Creator would have screwed up if he made man a social animal, if he created man for the social state to be a social animal, and then didn't give mankind the wisdom and the virtue and the talents necessary to manage it, to bring it about. But Jefferson recognizes that everybody wasn't given it. Only a few were given it. That's the natural aristocracy. May we not even say, Jefferson says, that that form of government is best, which provides the most effectually for a pure selection of these natural aristoi into the offices of government, ? In other words, Jefferson is saying the form of government that is the best one is the one that makes it possible to select the best people to run the show. Whatever system of government that is, that's the best one, because it's going to put decision-making into the hands of the people most qualified to have it. The artificial aristocracy, Jefferson says, is a mischievous ingredient in government, and provision should be made to prevent its ascendancy. I think the best remedy is exactly that provided by all of our constitutions: to leave it to the citizens the free election and separation of the aristoi from the pseudo-aristoi, the pseudo-aristocrats, of the wheat from the chaff. In general, they will elect the really good and the really wise. In some instances, wealth may corrupt, birth may blind them, but not in sufficient degree to endanger the society. Jefferson believes that the best way to guarantee the separation of the natural aristocracy from the pseudo-aristocracy, later on he uses a phrase which I like even better. He calls the artificial aristocracy the tinsel aristocracy. I love that term, the tinsel aristocracy. These are the products of wealth and position and ambition. These are the people who marry for advantage, for position, for their own self-interest. These are the people who intermarry, even though when they produce children, they pay no attention to the kind of children they will produce. All they care about is getting involved, entering a marriage, which is going to be to their best interests. That's all they care about. So Jefferson says, if you remember, people, they end up marrying people who are ugly and crude and cruel and unsophisticated and all the rest of it, even though they risk bringing into the world children who will inherit many of these same characteristics. These people are so self-absorbed that they don't even care. And of course, the implication for Jefferson is we need to care, because if we allow too many of those tinsel aristocrats to get into power, we're all going to suffer for it. Our job is to get the right people in power. And of course, what Jefferson is going to propose is a system of education from one end of society to the other, which allows us to educate people in order to protect society from the artificial and then give them the ability to discover the natural leaders. To Jefferson, that's why education is so important. He believes that the future of the republic depends on the quality of education at all levels in order to give people the tools they need to be able to separate the true aristocrats, the true natural aristocracy, from the tinsel one, the artificial one. Jefferson says, at the first session of our legislature after the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia legislature, of course, is what he's talking about. The very first session of the Virginia legislature after the Declaration of Independence, we passed a law abolishing entails. And then in parentheses, limitations on the inheritance of property to a specified succession of heirs. Close parentheses. In other words, the first thing we did after independence was abolish entails, abolish the idea that the only way property could be passed on from one generation to the other was to be passed on as a whole, to perpetuate the aristocracy from one generation to the next. By abolishing entails, what you basically do is create a situation where estates will be broken up. Therefore, the aristocracy will not be passed on. Position and wealth will not be passed on from one generation to the other just naturally because of who your parents are or what your family name is. Jefferson said that's the first piece of legislation we passed after the Declaration of Independence. And then he says, and this was followed by one abolishing the privilege of primogeniture, the eldest child's specific right of inheritance. We also made it possible for a parent, for the owners of the estate, to divide the estate up among all the children, rather than being required by law to pass it on in toto, as a whole, to the eldest son. In effect, what Jefferson is saying is that by doing those two things, by passing those two bills, what we did is to promote the kind of society that would prevent an artificial aristocracy of wealth and ambition and birth to normally assume positions of power ever again. We were striking a blow against the artificial or the tinsel aristocracy, Jefferson is telling Adams. These laws, he says, drawn by myself, laid the axe to the foot of pseudo-aristocracy. And had another which I prepared been adopted by the legislature, our work would have been complete. It was a bill for the more general diffusion of learning. This proposed to divide every county into wards of 5 or 6 miles square, like your townships. Remember, he's talking to Adams, and he's talking about creating political entities called hundreds of 6 miles square, kind of like New England towns, to establish in each ward a free school for reading, writing, and common arithmetic, to provide for the annual selection of the best subjects from these schools, who might receive at the public expense a higher degree of education at a district school, and from these district schools to select a certain number of the most promising subjects to be completed at a university, where all the useful sciences should be taught. Worth and genius would thus have been sought out from every condition of life and completely prepared by education for defeating the competition of wealth and birth for public trusts. Jefferson saw his bills, especially the bills for the general diffusion of knowledge, as educating everybody in order to be able to spot the difference between a true aristocrat and a phony one. And Jefferson believed then that the strength of the republic and the protection of individual rights was best left to an educated citizenry, to a citizenry who had been prepared, who had been educated to assume the responsibilities of citizenship. And that way, you would eliminate the tendency to just vote for the rich guys, the powerful ones, the influential ones. You can see how successful, or perhaps you could say how unsuccessful, Jefferson's proposals were as you begin to look around and look back. I think in this letter, we find out more about what motivated our education system, what motivates the Republic, what these people who created it believed you had to do in order to make it work. With this kind of a background, if you now take on Madison's Federalist Number 10, you can begin to see even more clearly where Madison was coming from. The last paragraph that I would share with you today on this, from this particular letter. With respect to aristocracy, Jefferson said, we should further consider that before the establishment of the American states, nothing was known to history but the man of the old world, crowded within limits either small or overcharged, and steeped in the vices which that situation generates. A government adapted to such men would be one thing, but a very different one, that for the men of these states. Here, everyone may have land to labor for himself, if he chooses, or, preferring the exercise of some other industry, may exact for it such compensation as not only to afford a comfortable existence, but the wherewith to provide for a cessation from labor in old age. This society in America, this republic, gives men from the old world opportunities that they never had there. Here, there's enough land for everybody to become a landowner, everybody to gain some status, some respectability. If they choose not to work the land, then they can sell it. And they can reap enough profit from the land to take care of themselves through their old age so that they don't have to continue to work right up until the time that they die. Everyone, Jefferson says, by his property or by his satisfactory situation, is interested in the support of law and order. That's a key sentence. What Jefferson is saying here is the mere fact that land is available to everybody who chooses to take advantage of it, by definition means that those people who become property owners become supporters of law and order. Because now lawlessness and disorder threaten their property, threaten their livelihood. So by giving them access to land, you are giving them the kind of vested interest or a stake in society that guarantees that they will be concerned, intelligent, aware, informed citizens, which is what our republic must have. And such men, Jefferson said, may safely and advantageously reserve to themselves a wholesome control over their public affairs and a degree of freedom which in the hands of the canaille, the masses of the cities of Europe, would be instantly perverted to the demolition and destruction of everything public and private. In other words, one of the things that we've accomplished here in this republic, in this new land, is to eliminate the idea of the masses, the group with nothing, which is committed to overthrowing those with property. In other words, you guarantee the stability of society because you eliminate the need for mass movements because of the inequities in society, because there's opportunity available to everyone in this society. By giving everyone access to opportunity, you make civil war and revolution unnecessary. Jefferson closes by saying, the history of the last 25 years of France and of the last 40 years in America, nay, of its last 200 years, proves the truth of both parts of this observation. In other words, the history of Europe, Jefferson said, the French Revolution, clearly indicates what happens when there is not equity, when there is not opportunity and stability and respect available to everybody. And Jefferson associates this with the availability of property. Later on, several years later, in 1829, when Madison writes that letter in his journal supporting an end to property qualifications for voting and office holding, Jefferson argues that the direction of development in this country is suggesting that there is a growing number of people in this society for whom land property is not possible. And it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. There's going to be a larger and larger percentage of the American population who not only don't own property, but who likely will never have an opportunity to own property. And that's going to mean that all of the security, all of the benefits of law and order that we were able to depend on before because of the availability of property would be gone. And that's when, you'll remember, Madison made the point that what we've got to do is allow these people the right to vote and hope that the right to vote, the right to participate in making the laws under which they are asked to live, will give them a sense of importance and vested interest that property is no longer available to do. I guess what I'm saying is that if you think back to previous programs that we've been doing here at the Virtual Center, we can begin to see the connections, the links that begin to tie all of this together. I just think it's absolutely fantastic. That's the letter of October 28th, 1813, Jefferson to John Adams, in which Jefferson is explaining the difference between the natural aristocracy, the true aristocracy of talent and virtue and wisdom, as opposed to the artificial or the tinsel aristocracy based on wealth and birth. What we've got to do then is educate the masses of the public to be able to tell the difference. We've got to make sure that citizens, voters, are looking for the natural aristocrats, looking for natural ability and natural talent. In other words, inclined to vote and support those who really can lead, as opposed to being bamboozled and hoodwinked by artificial aristocrats who don't have the talents and don't have the virtue and don't have the ability to hold positions of influence and power in our society. I think as we approach the elections this fall, next week begins the Republican convention in Cleveland. The week after that is the Democratic convention in Philadelphia. It seems to me that if you take Jefferson's letter and you begin to apply it to our contemporary, our political situation today as citizens, and I hear people talking all the time, I don't know how I'm going to vote. I had breakfast this morning with a close friend, and he's a Republican, been a lifelong Republican. And he said to me over breakfast this morning, honestly, I can never vote for Donald Trump. I'm having real problems thinking about voting for Hillary. I don't know what I'm going to do. When election day comes, I might be nowhere near there. Because I honestly don't know what I'm going to do. I know what I can't do. And that's vote for Donald Trump. So in a sense, this may be the real issue in this campaign. And, some of the political strategies associated with this campaign are interesting. We were talking politics over breakfast this morning, as I mentioned. And I made the point to my friend. And when I thought about it, after I heard it come out of my own mouth, I began to appreciate how absurd this is. And I said, the fact of the matter is, as unpopular as Hillary Clinton is, as how dominant the numbers tell us the lack of trust in Hillary Clinton is, the only political candidate whose numbers are higher in the area of distrust is Donald Trump. And so what we're hearing from people in the Trump campaign, and I heard this just last night, is that the Trump strategy is to so pillory Hillary that you cause her unfavorable numbers to grow to the point that they approach his. Think of that. Think about the reality of that. That if the competition is between you and me, and my unfavorables are higher than yours, then my strategy is not to lower my unfavorables. My strategy is to increase yours. So that hopefully if I play my cards right, I'm going to make you look worse than they think I am. And that's the choice you're giving to the American people. On the basis of this letter from Thomas Jefferson to John Adams in 1813, I would suggest to you that Jefferson, I don't know if he'd be rolling in his grave or whether he'd be laughing at the absurdity of what we've become. But again, I think all of it speaks to the realities of what we've been talking about. Because the elections, as we run them, are designed to appeal to particular groups and designed to make candidates look attractive to this group and that group and the other group. Nowhere is there any evidence that all of the members of these groups are really connected by something so deep and so fundamental that our political system can't even begin to address it. Rather, what our political system is designed to do is function on the basis of the self-interested definition of human nature that focuses on the divisions between us rather than the commonalities amongst us, which goes all the way back to the beginning on the racial issues associated with this. So again, it seems to me, and I know we're getting towards the end of our program. We're at 55 minutes after the hour, so we've got about 3 minutes left in our program today to wrap it up. It seems to me that the real solution to the racial issues all around us that we hear people talking about all around us is to begin to seriously question the extent to which we focus on the differences amongst us rather than the things that unite us. I think that's the key. I don't think it's not a criticism of us, because we've been raised in a society which tells us that that's really the only thing that there is. That's the only way we can operate, because that's what human nature is. So it seems to me we need to go all the way back to that beginning. Yesterday, we looked at the piece written in the Washington Post last week on the 6th of July by George Will, and his reference to the Coleman Report in the early 1960s and the Moynihan Report on the Negro family that followed it, and the point that Coleman and Moynihan were both making, that the real issue, racial issue in this country, is driven not so much by educational deficiencies, and definitely not by the amount of money that is or isn't allocated in particular school districts. That really the important factor in education in our society is the social background that young people come from. Whether in fact their parents read to them, whether they had a stable home, whether they ate dinner together, whether their parents read to them when they were youngsters, and on and on and on. We know that there are certain levels of citizens who do that as being part of their responsibilities as a parent. And we know that there are so many of our young people that never get to experience that. And so we seem to wallow around function, trying to figure out how to make up for those deficiencies. It seems to me that we can't fix those deficiencies until we get to the source of the problems. Why is it that certain citizens are treated differently than other citizens? Why is there an element of racism, an element of distrust? What is there in our culture, in our society, that causes us to look constantly at the other or for the other? Instead of seeing that we are all the same, we tend to look for the things that separate us. Until we begin to recognize that and address it, it seems to me that we can't resolve some of the problems that are the product of that. I think that's our challenge. And I think as we think about tomorrow's program, we need to think seriously about the extent to which the founders probably had more to tell us on this issue than we ever dreamed. We're at 58 minutes after the hour, and so I'm going to close. We have 1 minute left in our program today. Just time to thank you for tuning in and inviting you to tune in tomorrow here at the Virtual Center. We'll begin tomorrow at our regular time. We'll have our full 2 hours of programming. And at this point, I don't see any reason why there would be any reason we would not have a program tomorrow. So I do invite you to join us tomorrow. And I want to thank you for joining us today. I hope that you have a wonderful afternoon and evening. And I hope that you'll be kind to each other. And look for the good in others. It's all around us. I truly believe that. Thank you so very much for your time and attention. I appreciate it so much. Thank you.